Dissociative identity disorder does not require trauma to be diagnosed. Endogenic systems are medically recognized. It's important not to trust random people on the internet when they tell you things. Look for evidence. Look for facts.
Look for evidence. Look for facts.
Do y'all want to know something that really grinds my gears? Random people on the internet who purposely cherry pick and misrepresent scientific studies to support their invalid narratives. This here is Void Spooks. He imitates DID online and has built his entire identity around misrepresenting research to uphold his internalized victim complex. And like the last time I covered Void, I'll be pausing his video to analyze each of his sources. So let's go ahead and get started.
Dissociative identity disorder does not require trauma to be diagnosed. Endogenic systems are medically recognized. It's important not to trust random people on the internet when they tell you things. Look for evidence. Look for facts. Today we are going to be showing you evidence and facts, all published by the American Psychiatric Association, who are the people who make the DSM-5. Here are the diagnostic criteria for dissociative identity disorder. You'll notice that none of them state that trauma is necessary. Here are the diagnostic features of dissociative identity disorder. You'll notice again that it doesn't mention trauma as a requirement. This is because dissociative identity disorder is not a trauma disorder. It is a dissociative disorder, and it falls under the dissociative disorder category, which, as you can see here, are two separate categories. Some people say that the reason that it is not part of the diagnostic criteria is because no diagnostic criteria requires trauma, because requiring trauma would be unethical, because they would be torturing children somehow. One, that's not how research works, and two, here's the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. It requires trauma. Here's the diagnostic criteria for acute stress disorder. It also requires trauma. This is because these disorders are trauma disorders. So while dissociative identity disorder is heavily related to trauma, you can be diagnosed without trauma. It's not part of the diagnostic criteria.
So basically, Void here is trying to argue that endogenic DID systems like himself are recognized in the medical community. And for those of y'all who might not be familiar, an endogenic system is basically somebody who is imitating or self-diagnosing DID without any history of trauma. So in other words, they're malingering under a new label. Now, the first source he brings up is the DSM-5's diagnostic criteria for DID, and he is right that it does not explicitly list trauma as a requirement in the same way that it does for PTSD. But the reason for this is actually pretty straightforward, and it's because dissociative amnesia is central to a diagnosis of DID. Criterion B states that a person must experience, quote, recurrent gaps in the recall of everyday events, important personal information, and or traumatic events that are inconsistent with ordinary forgetting. So, someone with DID can have distinct chunks of memory about normal daily life and traumatic experiences. And that's why the DSM leaves some flexibility. It's not because quote-unquote endogenic systems are recognized. It's because amnesia in DID can extend to the trauma itself. Now, I do want to be clear that dissociative amnesia and repressed memories are extremely complex and need to be handled with caution. Genuine repressed memories will usually show up as flashbacks when your brain is ready to process them, and they're often triggered by reminders of the trauma. They're not something that you should ever try to dig up on your own or through recovered memory techniques. And this is because false memories can happen, which is exactly why DID has become one of the most controversial and politicized diagnoses to date. Now, what's especially concerning is how some self-described quote-unquote traumagenic DID creators on TikTok use repressed memories to defend their position against endogenic systems without outright fake claiming them. In doing so, they end up telling their younger viewers caught up in TikTok's DID trend that they, quote, just don't remember their trauma yet. And that is a seriously dangerous message to send, because for people with real repressed memories, being pushed to confront them too early can destabilize their recovery. And for people without them, peer pressure in online spaces like Discord servers or TikTok subcultures can actually create false memories. In addition, there is way more to the DSM than the diagnostic bullet points that Void cherry picks. For example, under the environmental risk factors, the DSM explicitly lists chronic childhood trauma as the only known environmental risk for developing DID, with around 90% of cases involving multiple forms of abuse beginning before age 6 and almost always at the hands of a caregiver or family member. The other 10% are linked to extreme experiences like terrorism or human trafficking. Under gender-related diagnostic issues, they note that there are few differences in symptom profile or childhood trauma history between men and women, again reinforcing that trauma drives this condition. And under the course modifiers, the DSM points out that, quote, ongoing sexual, physical, and emotional trauma often leads to poor outcomes in later functioning. So, in other words, DID develops out of ongoing trauma early in life, and continued trauma makes recovery even harder. So, when Voigt claims that the DSM leaves space for DID without trauma, he's not revealing some overlooked nuance. He's just misreading the text. What Voigt is doing here is deliberately misinterpreting the DSM and weaponizing its cautious wording to make it sound like it supports endogenic DID when it never even hints at that. His next point, though, is just as surface level as the first one. He says that DID is not a trauma disorder because it's under the dissociative disorders category and not the trauma and stressor-related disorders category. But notice how he never actually says trauma and stress-related disorders out loud. And I think it's because he knows that the moment he does, his whole argument falls apart. Because only 2 disorders in that category actually require trauma as defined by the DSM, meaning exposure to an actual or perceived threat of violence or death. So the claim that DID isn't a trauma disorder because it's not in that section just doesn't make any sense. Because not every disorder in the trauma and stress-related disorders category is trauma-based to begin with. And if you read the introduction to the dissociative disorders chapter that Boyd literally put on his screen, it spells out the connection clearly. It says that, quote, dissociative disorders are frequently found in the aftermath of a wide variety of psychologically traumatic experiences in children, adolescents, and adults. Across cultures, risk factors for dissociative pathology include earlier onset of trauma, neglect, sexual, physical, and emotional abuse by parents, cumulative early life trauma and adversities, and repeated sustained trauma or torture associated with captivity, such as prisoners of war and victims of trafficking. There is nothing ambiguous about that, and nowhere in there does Voigt fit in. But I also know that Voigt's entire argument hinges not on the actual scientific understanding of DID that the DSM is trying to provide, but on the fact that the DSM's wording doesn't explicitly deny the possibility of endogenic DID. He's grasping for any validation loophole that he can find, because deep down, he knows that he doesn't actually have DID. His third point, though, is the one that really gives away just how little he understands about research, and I'm gonna go ahead and replay that right quick.
Some people say that the reason that it is not part of the diagnostic criteria is because no diagnostic criteria requires trauma, because requiring trauma would be unethical, because they would be torturing children somehow. 1, that's not how research works, and 2, here's the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. It requires trauma. 1, that's not how research works.
So you can tell that Voigt has never participated in research, not academically, not professionally, not even casually scrolling Google Scholar. And like most people in the online DID subculture, he just doesn't know how research actually works. Because if he did, he would know that there are plenty of rodent paradigms that model trauma. Researchers induce trauma in mice through electrical shocks, maternal deprivation, or predator exposure, all to study how it affects behavior and physiology. PTSD-like symptoms are studied this way because fear conditioning and hyperarousal exist across species, but DID is inherently human. It's far too complex and requires a cohesive sense of self and higher-order brain function that rodents simply don't have. And theoretically, the only way to experimentally prove that DID is caused by trauma would be through unethical human studies, like literally torturing children. So yes, Void, that is how research works. And if you'd spent even half a second in an actual lab, you'd know that. Now, his second and final source is one of the worst pieces of literature I've ever read. But before I start to rant, here's the rest of the clip.
Our next source was also published by the American Psychiatric Association. It has an entire chapter on plurality and talks multiple times about how plurality is not confined to people who have trauma and not confined to the diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder or other disorders. Here is the summary of that chapter. Let me read you off a few of the key points. Plurality is not the same as dissociative identity disorder, but makes up one part of it. Many people are quite happy with the alters present inside of them. Plurality is not necessarily caused by trauma, although trauma can be a part of the overall picture.
And now let me read to y'all Eric Yarbrough's citations. The first one is the DSM-5, which, as I've already explained, does not validate endogenic or iatrogenic DID. Thankfully, Yarbrough only cites the DSM when describing DID and never takes a stance on whether it develops due to trauma. He also cites Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery, which is literally about chronic trauma and completely contradicts what Voigt is arguing. Yarbrough only cites one actual research study in this chapter, and it's a 2006 paper on the prevalence of DID. But this citation has nothing to do with causation, and it's kind of like a duplicate citation because it's the same study that the DSM-5 references when they discuss prevalence. Finally, Yarbrough's last source, because yes, the man only cites 4 sources, isn't even scientific or academic. It's literally a random website run by some life coach company. And somehow, Dr. Eric Yarbrough uses that to back the entirety of his argument. This chapter is heavily opinionated and has zero scientific evidence backing any of its claims. And I don't really care if it was published by the APA because aside from the obvious that placing blind trust in a publisher rather than evaluating the actual research is a fatal mistake, I think that there are 2 main reasons that this chapter made it to publication. The first reason is structural. This book is about transgender mental health, which is a completely separate field from trauma research. Interconnected? Sure, but the people reviewing this book for publication would have specialized in gender dysphoria, not trauma and dissociation. Yarbrough is clearly writing outside of his professional scope. Now, the second reason, and this is more my personal opinion, has more to do with the political climate. This book came out in 2018, and who was halfway through his presidency in 2018? This guy. And do y'all know who consistently spoke out against Trump's anti-trans policies? The APA. In 2017, 2018, and 2019, the APA released statements opposing Trump's ban on transgender service members. In 2020, just months after Trump rolled back anti-discrimination protections for trans people in healthcare, the APA sent a letter to then President-elect Joe Biden urging him to reverse those policies, which he did on his first day in office. Ever since the release of the DSM-5, which replaced gender identity disorder with gender dysphoria and fundamentally changed how trans people are treated in psychiatry, the APA has been advocating for us. So I think that they let this 8-page off-topic chapter slide, not because of its accuracy or scientific rigor, but because it was tucked away in a book focused on a completely different branch of psychiatry that was and still is under political attack. And personally, I think that including this chapter does more harm to trans people than good, because then we get people like Void using it to justify his delusions about endogenic DID, and honestly, we've got way too much going on right now to be dragged into this mess.
In conclusion, everything we said at the beginning of the video is factually correct.
In conclusion, absolutely nothing that he said in his video is factually correct. He only cites 2 sources, one of which was a gross misrepresentation of the DSM-5, and the other did not provide any scientific evidence, nor cite any scientific sources that validate so-called endogenic DID or plurality.
Denying the existence of endogenic systems is not only bigoted,
Denying the existence of endogenic DID is not bigoted. For one, the modern use of the word bigot specifically refers to protected classes of people with a history of systemic discrimination. And according to Void's second source, even if quote-unquote plurality or endogenic DID was a legitimate phenomena and, not a bunch of people mimicking the romanticized media portrayals of DID, based on what Void is saying, plurality would not be considered a disability and therefore is not a protected demographic and not something that can be subjected to bigotry.
It is factually incorrect. Thank you.
It's the smirk at the end that really gets me. It's honestly just a little sad because of how confident he is. Like, he genuinely thinks he just debunked an entire field of psychological research based on a few cherry-picked lines from the DSM and one very poorly researched chapter in a book about transgender mental health. But I guess ignorance really is bliss, especially for the ignorant. Alrighty, y'all. That's all I've got for today. I know that this is my first real voiceover, so I'm sorry if the audio quality is a little rough. I'm still getting the hang of recording instead of, using text-to-speech. Let me know in the comments if you'd rather I go back to the TTS voice or keep doing these voiceovers. If you like the video, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you want to see more deep dives like this. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.